On February 14th, 2018, 17 lives were lost, and so many more were devastated forever. Alyssa Aldeff, Scott Beagle, Martin Duque Anguiano, Nicholas Dwaret, Aaron Feiss, Jamie Gutenberg, Chris Hickson, Peter Wang, Luke Hoyer, Kara Loughran, Gina Montalto, Joaquin Oliver, Elena Petty, Meadow Pollock, Alina Ramsey, Alex Schachter, and Carmen Schentrup lost their lives on that day. They were sisters, brothers, sons, daughters, husbands, teachers. They were lives. Too many lives. Most of us know them as Parkland, but soon you won't even know them as that. Soon they'll be replaced by another name, another city, another school, another shooting. Orlando, Las Vegas, Aurora, Newtown, and Marshall County. There are too many names, too many victims, too many towns, and too many schools to recognize them all. And so there are too many for us to tolerate further. So what we're here to discuss today is where we are and where we can go. I'm very pleased to be joined for that conversation by this very distinguished panel. And so I'd like to introduce them. Professor Cedric Merlin Powell is a professor here at the University of Louisville Brandeis School of Law. You all know him. His JD is from the NYU School of Law, where he was managing editor of the NYU Review of Law and Social Change. He served a judicial clerkship on the D.C. Court of Appeals for the Honorable Julia Cooper Mack. He served as the Karpatkin Fellow in the National Legal Office of the American Civil Liberties Union. He recently, and this is probably the most amazing thing, served as our interim dean for academic affairs during an ABA visit. And as someone who's gone through a couple of SACS accreditations at the secondary level, that's stressful. That's very stressful. And so I'm sure we did very, very well. He specializes in race relations and constitutional law. We are pleased to welcome Professor Powell. Next, I want to introduce Connie Courtney. Connie is with the Kentucky chapter of Moms Demand Action, and the subheading of that group is for Gun Sense in America. Moms Demand Action is a grassroots organization founded in 2012 in response to the Sandy Hook shooting, what I referenced earlier as Newtown. It quickly flourished into a leading force for gun violence prevention with chapters in all 50 states. Now, what you should know is that this started as a Facebook page. A woman named Shannon Watts started this, and it has grown to cover the entire nation. They support the Second Amendment, but believe in common sense solutions to help decrease the escalating epidemic of gun violence that kills too many of our children and loved ones every day. Some of their victories, and there is a huge list of them on their website, include keeping concealed carry out of, or keeping open carry out of, and concealed, I believe, out of retail locations, Target and Starbucks, campaign to defeat dangerous gun laws, including keeping guns out of the hands of domestic abusers. I think that's pretty common sense, and permitless carry, which was actually put up in Kentucky but died in committee. It didn't make it out, and Moms Demand Action stood against that, where a person would be able to carry a gun just because they had a gun. There was no permit process at all. That was what was proposed, and Moms Demand Action stood up against that. We're pleased to welcome Connie Courtney. Finally, Congressman John Yarmuth. Very proud to have him here today. He represents Kentucky's 3rd Congressional District. If you live within shouting distance of this building, he's your congressman. So that's pretty cool. He's now in his 6th term, all right, and he's the top Democrat on the House Budget Committee, soon to be the ranking member on the House Budget Committee, I hope.
Chairman.
Yes, absolute chairman. Recognized for his work to improve education, expand access to affordable health care, and revitalize manufacturing in Louisville. He was born and raised right here in Louisville. And coming up on finals, I think we really have to talk about this F that you have on your report card. You have an F, and I think that that's something that most of us would be concerned about, but you don't seem to be too concerned about
Very
it.
proud of it.
Yeah, who's that from?
This is from the National Rifle Association.
So apparently, yeah, the National Rifle Association doesn't think much of your work. You have been the co-sponsor of H.R. 308, Large Capacity Ammunition Feeding Device Act, co-sponsor of H.R. 1781, requiring a background check for all firearm sales, co-sponsor of H.R. 591, which closes the gun show loophole, and you've recently introduced, and I want to talk about a little bit, the assault weapons ban of 2018. So that's in there. Fun fact, his son Aaron is also the owner and managing editor of Leo Weekly, which I'm sure you all have had opportunity to read. So please now give our...
employee of the University of Louisville also.
Oh, he is? So
Right,
he's a
yes.
cardinal. That's good to know. So thank you very much, Congressman Yarmuth, for being here. So I'm going to start off, and I'm going to ask each of our panel members just to kind of give an introduction, and I'm going to ask them to go in the order that I've introduced them. So Professor Powell first, then Ms. Courtney, and then the Congressman. And then with time remaining, we have some questions, lots of great questions, and I'll be sorting through those and listening too. So please, if you think of any other questions, if you have a piece of paper, write it down, bring it up. Don't be shy. We're here to ask questions, and as much as we can, we'll get them in there. And hopefully we get them all covered today. So, Professor Powell, can you kind of give us a little bit of an update on, bring us all up to speed on the things we should have learned in your class already?
Well, it's an honor to be here, and I enjoy these type of exchanges, so thank you for inviting me, and the distinguished panelists that I'm up here with. It's always an honor to see the Congressman. He's a great supporter of public transportation. I just got that plug in. And I'm honored to meet you too as well. So I'm a little nervous because I was running around and I just got back from out of town and I forgot my notes. So I see some con law students in here. If I forget anything, you just put in. This will be a review. This is a review of the doctrine of incorporation. So I'm going to talk about three cases. I'm going to talk about Heller versus, District of Columbia versus Heller, briefly, and then McDonald versus City of Chicago, and then a decision that you might not be aware of. Certiorari was denied in a case called Sylvester versus Becerra. I'm probably saying the wrong name. Xavier Becerra is the Attorney General of California.
It's Becerra.
Becerra, yeah. He used to be a congressman as well, right?
Yep.
And so Becerra is interesting because certiorari was denied, but Justice Thomas writes this long discussion, almost like a dissent to the denial of certiorari. So that's quite interesting. So Heller, McDonald. Becerra is interesting because it's just 2018 and just happened in February. So there was always this notion that where was the Second Amendment applicable? Was it fully applicable to the states? And you common law students know that we talked about the doctrine of incorporation and how the Bill of Rights is incorporated through the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. And what was left unresolved was this notion of whether or not the Second Amendment was fully applicable to the states. So we needed two cases to deal with that. We needed District of Columbia versus Heller, which is a 2008 case, and then McDonald versus City of Chicago, which was, I think, 2010, I believe. Yeah, 2010. So in Heller, there was a challenge to a D.C. law that regulated guns, and the court concluded that the Second Amendment protects the right to keep and bear arms for self-defense, striking down the D.C. law that prohibited possession of guns in the home. And so this was the first step. Heller didn't say that the Second Amendment was fully applicable to the states because, as you know, D.C. is a federal enclave. But it did establish the Second Amendment as an enumerated right, something fundamental, something that is rooted in the substantive due process clause that we all talked about. And so the discussion in McDonald versus City of Chicago was there was a ordinance in Oak Park, which is a Chicago suburb, and those laws were similar to the laws that were analyzed in District of Columbia. And then the only remaining question was, does the Second Amendment apply to the states? The court concluded that the Second Amendment does apply to the states. It is fully applicable. And then did a long discussion about the history of the right to bear arms and how that was applicable to the states. So the state regulatory power to regulate guns, the court said that that's still there, but it certainly has to be balanced with what it views as a fundamental right to possess arms. The Bill of Rights is fully incorporated, and the question was whether or not the right to keep and bear arms is fundamental to our scheme of ordered liberty. You remember that phrase from our substantive due process discussion. And so self-defense is a basic central component of the Second Amendment. We've always had this right historically, even though the Second Amendment talks about militia, Justice Scalia in the Heller case, and then Justice Alito in McDonald sort of disaggregate that and make it an individual fundamental right. And even goes through a history about post-Civil War America, where African Americans had, quote, the right to bear arms after the Civil War when they come back from the Civil War. And that's really ironic to use the history of slavery and Reconstruction to support the fundamental right to bear arms, but the court did that. And then there are a series of questions. Should the Second Amendment be singled out for unfavorable treatment just because you don't like the content of this law? Should we say the Second Amendment is not fundamental? The court said, no, it shouldn't be singled out. There's a constitutional right to bear arms, and the argument that the United States is out of sync with the rest of Western democracies, the court rejected this notion and said we have a unique history. The court also rejected the public safety argument and rejected this notion of federalism that, well, states should be free to experiment, drawing upon Justice Brandeis, states as laboratories of experimentation. And the court said the states are still free to experiment. We likewise reject their argument that we should depart from our established incorporation methodology on the ground that making the Second Amendment binding on the states and their subdivisions is inconsistent with principles of federalism and will stifle experimentation. So if we recognize this enumerated right to self-defense and bear arms, the court is saying that you can still regulate. So that really means that the right extends beyond a well-regulated militia to an individual right of self-defense. And there are arguments back and forth. So I'll just end with this. But Sarah is interesting because this case dealt with a 10-day waiting period in California. U.S. Supreme Court says we don't want to hear it. And Justice Thomas goes off because he says Heller means something, McDonald means something, and they stand for the proposition that the Second Amendment is enumerated, an enumerated right, and that the court is being selective in how it deals with enumerated rights. In other words, when something that isn't recognized in the Constitution, unenumerated right, the court bends over backwards to deal with that right. He cites abortion. He cites First Amendment protections for things that we find reprehensible. All of those things are privacy interests. And the court will go out of its way to protect those rights. But Justice Thomas says the court picks and chooses when it deals with the Second Amendment. It should have accepted this case because this isn't a right that's made up like those other rights, like privacy or reproductive freedoms or something that you have this exactly within the Constitution, a right to bear arms. And if the Second Amendment is an enumerated right, then the court should protect it. But Justice Thomas says that the court is very swayed by politics and culture wars in terms of whether or not to regulate or not. So he views this as an example of selective enforcement of enumerated rights, and he finds that very distasteful. So that's where we are now. I think some of the litigation and discussion will be on state power and how it regulates and tries to balance this enumerated right. And there may be other litigation in this Supreme Court, but this case at least sort of gives the indication that it may shift to the state sphere. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Courtney?
Do you want me to sit here? Is that better?
No, yeah, whatever
I'm
you're
fine.
comfortable
I'm fine
doing.
here. My name's Connie Courtney. I am the Kentucky State Chapter Lead for Moms Demand Action. And like was explained in the introduction, we're a nonpartisan grassroots organization started by Shannon Watts 5 years ago after the shootings at Sandy Hook. And that's basically when I became involved with the organization. At the time of the shootings at Sandy Hook, I had a first grader. And that shooting really shook me to the core. And I decided that I needed to get involved on this issue. I had a personal history with a family member who had attempted suicide with a firearm. My parents had tried to take and move the guns out of the house, gave them to us to store. But my family member still was able to purchase a gun, even though he had been some mental health issues. And so it really resonated with me. And so I looked online to try to find something, and I couldn't find anything. And then one day we were with some friends, and our friend said, there's these crazy group of moms up in Indiana, and they're marching around the state capitol about the issue of gun violence. And I said, that's my group. So I joined the organization. At the time I joined in the state, there were about 5 of us. Okay. So, and the very first thing that I did was they were taking moms to Washington, D.C., called Moms Take the Hill. That was in March of 2013, and I signed up to go. I'd never done any type of advocacy work before. I paid for my own airfare, paid for my own hotel, and we went and talked to our legislators in Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, Congressman Yarmuth is not my legislator. I'm in Thomas Massey's district, so we didn't get to meet with him. I'm sure he would have met with us, but so I just kind of took my involvement from there. I've been involved in legislative issues, and our chapter has grown over the last couple of years. We've bumped up our membership to about 5,000 members in the state, and worked on various bills. Like was mentioned earlier, basically in 2013, when Congress decided they were not going to pass universal background checks after the shootings in Sandy Hook, moms decided to approach the issue from the state angle. So we shifted our focus from federal legislation to state legislation, and that's where we kind of started doing our work. And so what we would do is we would show up at state houses, we would contact our legislators, we sat in on committee meetings, and we talked to them about the issue of gun violence in our communities. We wanted to be the counterweight to the NRA, which when I got involved, I didn't realize how gun bills were written in the state, but then I soon learned that there's a lobbyist that comes from the NRA, and he sits down with legislators and they write the bills. And I mean, this was all new to me because I really had no idea how this worked. I'm sure you're very familiar with this, but that was very eye-opening to me, simply because we know from statistics that most NRA members support things like common sense background check. Overwhelmingly, they do. And it seemed to me that the NRA had just gotten out of step, the leadership and the gun lobby had gotten out of step with their membership, and they didn't represent what the majority of their members wanted. So that was kind of eye-opening to me, and really, made me want to get more involved with the organization. So every year now we go to Frankfurt. This past year there were 3 basic bills that we were concerned about. One was guns on college campus. That's been introduced for the last 3 years. Another one was a school marshals bill, which would allow somebody with concealed carry weapons to carry on K through 12 campuses. And then the second bill was the one that you referenced, which is permitless carry, which would allow anyone to carry a concealed weapon with no training, no background check, no accuracy component. And those are bills that Moms fights against. We think there are certain situations and locations where guns should not be sensitive places, and that goes to Heller decision, which was mentioned in that there are limitations that can be administered as far as where you can carry a weapon and who can carry a weapon. And those are the issues that we fight back on. I'm happy to say that none of those bills moved in committee this year. We attended probably about 12 committee meetings last week when we thought there was a chance the school marshal bill was going to move. We had about a 6-hour notification. We had about 25 moms show up to the committee meeting. We drove over 400 emails and 200 phone calls in an hour to our legislators. And when we got there, they're like, our phones are blowing up, our emails are blowing up, what's going on with this bill? And so that's how we've tried to affect change, because it's much easier to affect change at the state level. They're not used to getting a lot, this week is different, but usually they're not used to hearing a lot from their constituents. And so just a few people showing up, making phone calls, can really make a big difference. And once again, we don't oppose the Second Amendment. A lot of our members are former military. I have 2 guys that speak for me that are former ATF agents. We just think with rights come responsibility, and there are limits at places where you can carry and should be able to carry a weapon, and who can carry a weapon. We're very much concerned about keeping guns out of the hands of dangerous people, so that's why background check is our #1 priority on all gun sales. We also do a component on education as far as safe storage, trying to make sure children don't get access to weapons. And then also we're concerned about gun trafficking, and then we're also concerned about where people can carry guns, whether it's on college campuses, in schools. Those type of facilities are what we're concerned about. So that's the work that we've been doing and how I've been involved.
Amazing. Thank you very much. Well, and with deference to our congressman at the state level, that's really work you can do, and I think that we've seen a lot of that, and people forget that. They want to vote for the upper ticket races. They leave everything on the bottom of the ballot in blank, or they just click whatever name looks good, and that's where you can really affect change. And I think that that's an important message, and I don't want that to slip past. Congressman Yarmuth, we've all been waiting, and now I'm going to be quiet.
That's all right. Thank you, David. Well, thanks to everybody for being here and showing interest in this issue. It really is an important one. And let me say a few things before I actually get into what I'll probably talk more about the politics of gun safety legislation, because the law has been taken care of and citizen action side. First of all, let me re-emphasize what David just said. I have said this for the last 2 years. Everybody who's come to Washington, they ask me, what can I do to improve my effectiveness in Washington, or our group's effectiveness in Washington? I say, ignore us. Ignore us. It's a waste of your time. And I'm not being really very facetious when I say that. For every issue, there are 100 lobbyists on each side. So don't for a minute think that your position is not being represented. And yeah, it helps if we get 5,000 emails about a particular issue. But generally speaking, everybody is preaching to the choir in Washington, okay? I don't have any people who basically ream me out over any positions. I get supportive stuff. It's not true of everybody, but it's true of most. Secondly, the way you can have a disproportionate impact on what happens in your state and in your localities. And that's why you need to spend your time locally and on the state level. Lastly, if you think about everything that's happened over the last 20 to 25 years in this country, every significant national change, with the exception of healthcare legislation, the ACA, has begun at the state level, whether it's, and I won't characterize good or bad, positive or negative, but you probably know where I stand. Gay marriage started at the state level, legalized marijuana started at the state level, voter suppression tactics always at the state level, restrictions on abortion rights, always at the state level. This is where stuff happens, and it's not accidental. It's not accidental. You've heard of ALEC, you've heard the Koch brothers. They are aggressively working at the state level to do damage. So that's important to recognize. So I don't consider it an insult at all. I think you're right on. Secondly, I know every one of you is registered to vote. You better be. And you better not just register, you better get out and vote. I think one thing that has happened over the last couple of years, both in Kentucky and across the country, is voters woke up to the fact that elections have consequences. It does make a difference who gets elected. So I'm not even going to suggest who you vote for, but it does make a difference. And we're seeing that in Kentucky with a radical change in policy on virtually every topic, and we're seeing it in Washington as well. So one last thing before I get into guns, keep your eyes open about what's happening next week in Washington. We're apparently going to vote on what's called a balanced budget amendment. This is an amendment to the Constitution that would require Congress to pass a balanced budget and implement a balanced budget every year. It's a really interesting constitutional issue. It is never going to happen, but the debate will be, I think, very, very important. And the Republicans are putting it forward because they want to force us to take an issue and say we're voting against a balanced budget. That's why they're doing it. But there really are some important implications for that debate, so throw that out. Okay, now, guns in Congress. David mentioned several of the pieces of legislation I've sponsored. I was one of the ringleaders of the takeover of the floor of the House in 2016 when we occupied the floor and for, a little over 24 hours and got all sorts of great national attention. The first photograph that came out of there that was broadcast all over the country I took. I would still have it on my phone. I got 2,500 new Twitter followers in one day. And what we were trying to do at that point was to say, just give us a vote on a simple measure to implement universal background checks. We're not saying that it has to pass. Just let us vote on it. And that's been, I think, one of the most incredibly frustrating things that we've been dealing with on the issues of gun safety. And by the way, there are parallels here with the immigration debate too, where we've been fighting for years just to get a vote on Dreamers and some other elements of the immigration debate. But the numbers are overwhelming. Close to 90% of Americans think there ought to be universal background checks. A substantial majority thinks there ought to be an assault weapons ban. Limitations on magazine capacity, substantial majorities on all of these things. And even among Republicans and even among NRA members. 75% of NRA members support universal background checks. And the statement that the NRA leadership is out of touch with their members is absolutely, absolutely true. Most NRA members do want to keep crazy people from getting guns because they respect the weapons that they own and they respect this right. So the NRA, all you have to do is watch Dana Loesch and some of her videos and you'll know they're out of step with most of civilization, actually, not just their membership. So here's kind of the two elements you need to be aware of in terms of Congress and gun safety measures. One is, this is largely an issue that relates to Republican primary politics. Okay? This is not in terms of the public. These are Republican members who are afraid that if they vote for universal background check, that they will be primaried by a more conservative Republican in their districts. Most of them are in relatively safe districts anyway. The ones who are in marginal swing districts probably are better off voting for gun safety legislation. But the ones who are in safe districts, they're afraid of a primary challenge. And that's why Republican leadership has tried to keep us from voting on anything. They don't want to put their members in the position of having to cast that vote. That's number one. Number two is, the way politicians calculate the political impact of issues, for a particular issue, is not how many people are for it. It's how many people move based on that issue. Okay, so in my congressional district, people used to say, oh God, how can you're so courageous to vote against the NRA on all these issues. I said, it's not courageous at all. I said, there may be, among my 730 or 40,000 constituents, there may be 2,000 people who would vote for or against a candidate based on his or her gun position. That's it. If all 2,000 of them vote against me, first of all, it doesn't make any difference. I win by larger margins than that, or at least, knock on wood, I have. But more importantly, those people are, 99% of them are going to be Republicans and not vote for a Democrat anyway. So that issue moves absolutely nobody. It's the same with abortion. Those issues don't move votes. So again, if you're in a very, very tight district, or if you're in the Republican district, it doesn't really matter for the general election for the Republican district. It matters in your primary. In a very, very tight district, if there are 2,000, if you're going to have a 50-50 race, those 2,000 votes that you might lose do make a difference. Point being, they don't care what the 90% or 95% of the public thinks about the issue. They're only worried about the ones they would lose potentially and whether that would make a difference in their election. So that's what we face, and it's a very, very frustrating dynamic, and I think it's very, very frustrating for the American people as well, who say, wait a minute, we all agree there ought to be universal background checks. Why can't we even get a vote in Congress? That's the reason why. The good news is things are changing. And I was out walking with the students a week ago Saturday here, and I'd met with the organizers before that, and I said, don't be frustrated if nothing happens in the next year, because probably nothing's going to happen. But if your generation and the millennials come out and vote in the same proportions that older voters vote, the game's over for the NRA. If you voted 40, 50, 60% instead of 15 to 25% like you've been voting, then the game is different. And that's why I'm very optimistic. Now, very optimistic about our democracy in the future. I'm very concerned about our democracy today. I think we're in very serious jeopardy of losing a lot of our democracy. But again, the future looks good if we can just get to the future. And so I will. I'll stop there because I know we have lots of good questions. And anyway, we're going to keep trying. That's the main thing. I ought to talk about my F button. So about 6 weeks ago, I was at dinner with my wife, my son, and his fiance, and we were talking about guns and so forth. And I said I was thinking about having a button made that said, I'm proud to have an F rating from the NRA. And my son's fiance said, why don't you just do an F? And I said, that's brilliant. So we had F buttons made. This son had F buttons made. We premiered them a week ago Tuesday. I started handing them out to my colleagues, and they put them on. And I tweeted out. I don't know if you're aware of this episode, but I tweeted out a picture of me with the button on my lapel. And then a guy named Carl Nett, who's a Republican candidate for Secretary of State, tweeted in reaction to it, you ought to move it to the center. I'm trained to shoot center mass. He's a former Secret Service agent. Center mass beats go for the middle of the torso. So that kind of took the whole thing national. So again, that was on a Tuesday. When I left Washington that Thursday afternoon, last time I checked it, that original tweet of mine had 1.3 million impressions, 40,000 likes, and 8,500 retweets, including, I'm most proud of, David Hogg, the kid from Parkland. And also John Cryer, the actor. So. And virtually all of my colleagues who did the same thing, tweeted out the button, were getting 6,000 likes, 5,000 likes. It had an enormous impact. And so we're going to keep doing it, keep pushing this. And the point being, of course, the NRA thinks they're doing us damage by giving us an F rating. We're proud of it. We think that's a great grade to get from the NRA. So anyway, the number of people who have liked this and retweeted all this stuff is an indication, I think, of how much there is a yearning for people involved in this issue to stand up and be counted and to take action. Thank you.
So I look like I'm studying for finals over here with all my paper around me, and I'm reading through my notes. And I had a couple of, and we put out to our membership. Membership has its benefits, so ask them for some questions. Hint, hint. Anyway, I want to start with a question, and I know you've kind of covered this, and I'm going to ask this directly to Congressman Yarmuth, but either of the rest of you are able to. Many people have seemingly had enough with Congress's paralysis on passing sensible gun legislation. Poll after poll shows that even amongst Republicans and NRA members, let alone the public, requiring universal background checks and longer waiting periods before purchase enjoy overwhelming majority support. Still, no meaningful legislation has been passed or been proposed, and I know you'll take issue with that. What exactly stands in the way of meaningful reform, and what will it take to break the current logjam? And I'll tag on to that. How do we do away with the polarization? You know, what are your thoughts on that? And maybe that kind of helps broaden the question. Congressman Yarmuth, I'll start with you.
Okay, thanks. Well, again, there's been a whole slew of bills introduced to do all these things that we've talked about. And so we are pursuing a legislative remedy. We've been trying to get what's called a discharge petition signed by 218 members. If 218 members sign a discharge petition, a bill automatically comes to the floor. The leadership can't block it. We're still, unfortunately, a few short. The question of polarization is something that's a much broader question that would take an entire session of this group to talk about. But suffice to say that whatever the issue is, almost without exception, the issues have become tribalized. So it doesn't really matter. The substance of the issue doesn't matter. It's just that Republicans are on this side, so you got to default to your Republican team, or Democrats on this side, you default to your Democratic team. Again, even religion's been politicized and tribalized now. So I don't know how to change that. But again, what will change it is when voters make gun safety a voting issue, and as opposed to just an issue they care about. And if we poll all the time, and if you poll the issues that people care about, number one is always jobs in the economy. Two might be retirement security, and you go through healthcare and immigration. And gun safety up until now has always been 9, 10, 11, 12.
Yeah.
I mean, that's where it ranks on voters' priority list. And so politicians see that and say, okay, I could go out on a limb, but not many people really care about this issue enough. I need to talk about jobs all the time. So this is something that's going to change as voters force and citizens force politicians to change. And that's why that march here a week ago Saturday was so inspirational. And Greg Fisher and I were walking with the kids. I shouldn't call them kids. They're much more mature than a lot of people who are in Congress and the General Assembly. And we were both getting emotional because it was like, this is the future. This is hopeful.
Yeah, they know and they're listening,
Yeah.
and they're speaking out, and I think
Exactly.
that's huge. I think that's great, and it's moving the needle, and we'll talk
moving
about
the
that a
needle,
little
right.
bit later on. But I'm really impressed by that too. When I was their age, I don't think I was doing those sorts of things, but maybe if I had, things would be different. And so it's great to see them getting more involved. Excellent. Either of my other panelists want to weigh in on the polarization that we see in this issue specifically? It's
Can I just add one sentence comment? The thing that is most powerful about those young people is that they don't care about partisanship.
Yeah.
It is totally issue-related and substance-related. It has nothing to do with Democrat or Republican.
Yeah, that's great.
I think that's what we encourage our members, that they need to become single-issue voters on this issue. If this is something, just like the week after the shootings at Parkland, we had 1,000 people contact us that wanted to get involved. And we've never seen that type of push. Not after Orlando, not after Vegas. So it does seem to us to be like a tipping point. There is a cultural shift happening right now, and we're trying to capitalize on that.
Professor Powell?
So I think it's important to have intergenerational coalitions. I think we have been emphasizing the youth, and I think that's excellent. But there has to be a blending of people with experience and the everything that's new isn't great, and everything that is old is not bad. So the broader coalitions that we can come up with will be better. And then secondly, not even dealing with the Second Amendment, but broadly, the political dialogue is in paralysis because we rationalize things that are reprehensible. And we need to break through that in order to have meaningful discussions. It's just, it's really depressing just to see the rationalization. You can vote for whoever you want to, that's fine. But the attempt to act like everything is normal undermines democracy. If you have valid concerns and are critiquing something, I think that's fully appropriate. But there's no way in the world that we should be waiting around saying, well, what was really meant was this, when you look at the disproportionate impact in everything, in all phases of structural inequality.
Very good. Thank you very much for that. This question was just handed to me, and I think it kind of builds on that. So I'm going to go ahead and ask this of you, Professor Powell. I've seen social media posts claiming that the Parkland kids are getting press and following because they are white, and that people still don't care about black lives. Is this a real issue or an attempt to drive a wedge? What is a good response?
It's both. It's both. I think that the leaders of the movement are great, and I think they're not doing that within their movement. At least they are reaching out across all boundaries with diversity. But that's an attempt to divide. I think you can look at the media and see what has been a favorable story. You know, Newtown was a horrible tragedy, and that should have started something, but it didn't.
Right.
But that's where the notoriety came in. Same thing here in Parkland. But I think the reason that people are talking about Black Lives Matter is because of the disproportionate impact on communities of color. And people talk about African American males, but it's happening to African American women as well. So these disproportionalities have to be explained some way, and we don't point to an individual discriminatory perpetrator, certainly systemic. And I think Black Lives Matter, people are saying we've been in the trenches for years, and now, but I think the coalitions are being built across boundaries so that isn't the case.
I think it's exciting what they share, too, the similarities in the movements, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Either of our other two
Yeah,
panelists?
well, I just want to say that a lot of times, I know I came to the movement on this issue because of the shooting at Sandy Hook, which was the mass shooting. But what we've learned is once you get involved in it is the day in and day out gun violence that affects our country. The mass shootings get the headlines, but you know, every day 90 Americans die by a firearm in our country. And that, I think, addresses that issue, and we try to highlight that so that people know, you know, it's just not the mass shootings, but there is a day in and day out issue that we need to address in our country that is uniquely American.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
Yeah, 13,000 plus shootings this year already, 1,100 and something last week.
And that doesn't count suicide.
It doesn't count suicide. Yeah. You referenced something that I've been talking about too, and I think there's a common thread between Me Too and Black Lives Matter and the March for Our Lives and all, and that is rank and file citizens have said they're calling bullshit on the whole system and saying we're going to take action, and we're going to force politicians to act, and that's healthy because I think they've also all kind of implicitly agreed that unless they actually make changes through elections, then none of their issues is going to get resolved in the way they want it to.
Absolutely. And a lot of your questions, thank you all for these great questions. They really are. But I got to boil it down to the central question. because a lot of you are throwing in, you got your view on these things. So I'm going to try to ask a question that covers everybody's kind of point. And I think that this one is important because retired Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens just came out with an opinion, his opinion, and I think that's important, and I think that's been reflected. But I want to ask this, and this was the best wording of this question. Considering the broad scope of the Second Amendment, do you view repealing the amendment as legitimate and a realistic solution to gun violence? And I'm just going to throw that one up in the air and step back. Who wants in?
Well, let me answer it in a way that won't get me in trouble. All of the legislative history, to the extent that there's legislative history for the Second Amendment, all of the Federalist Papers and so forth, leave to me an undisputed case that the Second Amendment is not relevant to 21st century America, or the 21st century world, 21st century civilization. The context of that debate was all about, with the lack of a standing army, how do we reconcile the rights of states to have a defense mechanism and so forth. Of course, the weaponry was totally different. So again, all of that context, it bears so little resemblance to contemporary society that I don't know how the amendment itself could be irrelevant. And Cedric might contradict me on this, but before Heller, the last Supreme Court case was back in the 30s that related to the Second Amendment, 1930s.
I think that's right.
And before this current administration, the last prior 8 attorneys general, representing very different presidents, they all said the Second Amendment does not guarantee an individual right to own weapons. So Heller was a dramatic departure from contemporary legal thought. So
Yeah, it's the law of the land. It just is what it is.
it is what it is.
Yeah, so, anybody else? Professor, you want to weigh in on the repeal of the Second Amendment?
Yeah, so I think Justice Stevens caught some heat from that, but I think what he is saying is, if you're talking about enumerated rights, then you should analyze it appropriately. The only way you get to the point that we are in now is in the Heller decision when Scalia sort of disaggregates this right of a well-regulated militia. That's something collective, that is something that's regulated, that is something that's limited. But then he finds in that, and taking it even further in McDonald, that there is this enumerated right to bear arms. And that's certainly an analytical leap, whatever you believe. But if you're going to do something, you should do it right. Do it in terms of interpreting it up or down. I think that's what Justice Stevens was getting at.
Okay. Ms. Courtney?
Well, I'm a realist, so I can't even imagine a situation where a repeal of the Second Amendment. I just can't. So, I mean, it's not really something, I haven't had a chance to read that article. So it's just not really something that our group even, obviously does not advocate for. So, that would be my comment on it.
And that's why Sylvester versus Becerra is so important, and that's why Justice Thomas dissents, because I think he knows that if the U.S. Supreme Court isn't going to accept these cases, it's going to happen on the state level. So that's where the regulation battle will probably be fought, on the state level.
Yeah, the next case, by the way, I suspect will come because in the budget bill that we passed last week, which is bizarre on many levels, there's a new provision in the law that basically gives reciprocity for any state's gun laws to be it's mandatory that every state recognize another state's gun laws. So if you live in a state that is open carry, no permit restrictions, no training, and Kentucky wants to pass something different, we can't impose that on a citizen from that state when he or she comes to Kentucky. So that's going to be a real challenge to the state's the whole question of flexibility, experiment.
Yeah, but that's state by state too, and that kind of builds on a question that we had about reciprocity of the handgun permit, the concealed carry permit, being recognized the same way that a driver's license is. I wasn't even aware that that legislation had been floated. Is that basically part of that, or is this beyond the scope of the legislation that you're talking about, Congressman?
It's somewhat related, but it's not the same bill. At the state level, and there's certain people in the federal level who want to make it as easy as possible and make gun ownership as unrestricted and unfettered as possible. And they're going to continue to try to advance those bills, both on the state level and on the federal level.
And I have a little, did everybody get to weigh in on that one as much?
And that is the NRA's number one priority, is national reciprocity. That's
It
their
is.
golden child, yes.
Oh, really? Okay, very good. Very good. A little something from the I Know Where My Bread Is Buttered file. The American Constitutional Society National submitted a question that I love. So I'm going to, again, put this out to probably you, Professor Powell, but certainly you too, Congressman, and Ms. Courtney. I'm concerned that even if we have sensible gun laws, conservative courts could strike them down. What can House members do to help make sure there's a focus on the courts in addition to substantive issues? So from the perspective of the courts, and I think that's an interesting, I learned from you, the three co-equal branches of government, and they're very important, and the law gets made in the legislative branch, it gets interpreted in the judicial branch, and so how do we make sure that once we can, we do? Anybody?
That question threw me off because it was talking about the role of the courts, and then it shifted to the House, so I didn't get it.
I think because we have the Congressman, they went that way.
Yeah.
But feel free to, just to break it down from the role of the courts. I mean, ultimately, is there a bulletproof law? Is there something that we could write that is short of the repeal of the Second Amendment, which everybody seems, look, maybe two people in the whole wide world have ever floated. And it just so happened that a retired Supreme Court justice did. I don't think much of anybody else has. So how do we protect these laws so that they can't be interpreted? I mean, is there a way to write so narrowly that they can't be misinterpreted, or?
Well, I don't know. I think it's going to be case by case because even in Heller and McDonald, you have the court saying, we're recognizing this enumerated right. Now the states have to understand how to balance any type of regulatory framework so it doesn't undermine it or dilute that enumerated right. And they don't answer that question, so I don't think we know. So I think they are attuned to what federalism means, but I think if it came down to it between the autonomy of the state to regulate and this enumerated right, the court would probably choose the enumerated right. And I think the court is content to say, we've done McDonald, we've done Heller, that's enough. And that's an indication of that. I think that's what Justice Thomas dissents. So it'll take a major case for it to come up again to even talk about the Second Amendment. Practically speaking, the repeal, that's not going to happen. Constitutional Convention coming out of that's not going to happen.
Yeah, if you don't understand that, come up and grab one of those copies of the Constitution, have a look at how we amend the Constitution. It's not something that can be done, you can't stuff that into a sewer bill. Let me just put it that way. All right? We're, all my Kentucky people, holla. No.
Well, let me just put it this way. Practically speaking, if this Republican-controlled Congress, if it were to pass something, it wouldn't pass something on the conservative side. On the liberal side, it would be again some effort, like reciprocity or something that would expand the rights. And so I don't think that there's a challenge there. And I think once we take over the Congress, which hopefully will be next year, and we pass universal background checks, which probably, if we can get it through the Senate, which would be tough but possible, it'd be interesting to see what President Trump does with that if he's still in office. And But if it were to somehow be enacted, universal background checks, some limitation on magazine capacity, assault weapons ban, waiting periods, whatever it might be, I think the court is I don't think there's anybody who thinks that the Supreme Court would overturn those, because they said clearly in Heller that those things are okay.
Yes, yeah, done and done. And I want to get to, I'm sorry, Ms. Courtney, I don't think, did you not?
No,
Yeah, that's.
I think they got it.
We got to talk about schools, and we got to, because that's something that we hear a lot about. And here's a question, and again, this really distills a lot of the issues. One solution to gun violence in schools has been school resource officers, and I'll add to that arming teachers, which I haven't met a teacher yet that wants a gun. However, this solution hasn't seemed to prevent a single school shooting, but have furthered the criminalization/incarceration of especially black and minority students. What alternatives are reasonably achievable for states? And please, understanding that I'm distilling this down, frame your response in, guns in schools. Why is that an applicable solution to this issue legally? I think we need to keep it in that frame.
Well, I can only speak to our opposition to guns in schools. It's because school resource officers are completely different than arming a teacher. And anytime we've looked at these bills, and our people have looked at these bills, is there's no additional training requirement contained in the bill. So there's no live action situation, there's no psychological testing, none of those components that our trained law enforcement have been included in those bills. And that's why we are always opposed to those, because we think you're putting the onus on a teacher who's not prepared to handle that type of situation. And like you, I've not met one teacher that has wanted that responsibility. And so that's our opposition. And it was interesting because I just heard yesterday about the shooting in Hardin County, where the thing that stopped that gentleman from entering the building was a locked door. And that's what kept him out of that school. And when we've heard from security professionals in the state that deal with safe schools, and they said, if you want to really make the school safe, why don't you make sure all the doors are locked? Because that's something that's not done uniformly across the state. And that's an easy first step. But they always want to go to arming a teacher. That seems to be their initial request every single time. And that's just the proliferation of guns anywhere. And that's why we oppose those bills.
Okay, thank you, that's that, yeah.
The mistake is thinking that anything you do is going to stop any conceivable attack. And the doors were locked at Sandy Hook, and the guy just broke in a window and got in anyway. Somebody who's intent on doing damage and doesn't care whether they live or die is probably going to succeed. But there's the suggestion that every school have metal detectors at every entrance. Well, yeah, that would probably stop a lot of people.
Yeah.
But it also is incredibly expensive, and schools don't have that kind of money. So there are a lot of steps. School resource officer is the first step, but you get a campus like Parkland where it's multiple buildings and multiple entrances and 3,000 kids. I'm not sure I am sure there is no foolproof method that would stop every potential attack.
Yeah, and I don't hear anybody saying that school resource officers are a bad idea. If highly trained individuals are placed at schools, I don't want my stepdaughter going to school in Beirut. I don't want it to look like that. That's not my America. I think we can do better, but if that's a first step, then I think that that's certainly reasonable.
I think one of a bill that I think in Florida was proposed is the red flag, which would give law enforcement, school officials, the ability to petition to have guns removed from dangerous individuals. We think that's a much more proactive approach instead of trying to make our teachers the first line of defense. So those are things that we think can maybe curtail some of this type of violence. And I don't know if there's updates on a federal red flag legislation or.
I haven't heard of any.
Seems a little crazy to take a driver's license away from a habitual drunk driver, doesn't it? I mean, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
We're just asking to take away a weapon from somebody who's had a propensity for violence, danger. And I've been asked to recognize a good friend of ours, Dean Becker, you have a question that you'd like to ask?
Yeah, for Congressman Yarmuth and Ms. Courtney as a political strategy and Professor Powell as a legal strategy, it seems like the NRA spends its money in legislatures. And very seldom do you see them in court. And it seems to me that probably the more effective way to challenge the NRA is to get them in court. And we're not going to have national legislation. And we're not going to have statewide legislation in most states. But it seems like just at the municipal level, if you can get progressive municipalities to enact really restrictive gun laws, like we had in Heller and McDonald, and perhaps even more restrictive than those. I mean, Heller was limited to a handgun in the home. So something else that limits assault weapons or high-capacity magazines or whatever, and force the NRA to challenge those. And then you've got court decisions that actually say this is as far as the right goes, because now you've got legislatures passing or enacting lack of restrictions like open carry, concealed carry, and so on. But if we can go the opposite direction, but I don't know, what do you think of that?
I know in the state of Kentucky, there's a state law where municipalities cannot pass specific legislation as far as
Right.
gun laws. So that, I mean, there were bills introduced to overturn that so that Louisville could enact their own gun regulations, but that's a state law currently. But as far as I know.
I think of Kentucky as a lost cause.
Yeah, okay.
I'm thinking-
We're playing defense.
More ground than that.
I'm sure the blue
Present company
states.
excluded.
Yes.
You're talking Massachusetts there, or
Yeah,
or Hawaii.
Connecticut.
Illinois,
California.
again.
Connecticut has very restrictive gun laws. In the wake of Sandy Hook, they passed a lot of very restrictive gun measures, and they have been challenged, but they withstood the challenges. Not all of them have. There's also federal legislation that prevents a lot of it. Like, a lot of people say, well, what about trying to hold gun manufacturers liable? Well, that's been banned on the federal level. They've been indemnified. There have been, we tried to get the FDA to regulate guns as a safety measure. They've been banned from having any jurisdiction over guns. Same with Consumer Product Safety Commission. All those things have been banned. We just finally got the language in the budget bill to allow the Center for Disease Control specific language that said you can actually study gun violence. Because they've been saying that for the last few years they were prevented from doing so. They really weren't
requiring
prevented.
gun owners to carry liability insurance, same as automobile owners.
Yep,
Right.
yep, you could do that.
I want to speak to that.
That'd be a
for-
very effective one.
Yes, yeah, I think absolutely. I think, we do it for cars, and nobody's out in the street, talking about the repeal of any amendments, so why couldn't we do it for another thing that's just as likely to come?
And taxing ammunition, is another
Than
thing.
that.
Something that, the studying, what you said, studying gun violence to the CDC, that was actually banned in 1996 when the CDC was threatened with loss of funding because they were studying gun violence. They were trying to understand who commits gun violence, where are the guns coming from. Let's understand this as a whole. And I had a great conversation yesterday. Colton, I don't think he's here with us today, but stopped by and we had a conversation. And we represent two sides of this issue. And I think it always comes down to this. We don't really know what's going on. And even Paul Ryan said it. We need to study this. But we needed to study this a long time ago. Why haven't we, if, we know this is an issue? And I don't, maybe you could speak to that and the CDC and the funding, why was there reticence to understand gun violence?
Because the NRA didn't want them to do it.
Right.
So there's
Well, it was
one
called-
body.
It was called
yeah.
the Dickey Amendment, which prevented any money from being expended. It didn't specifically say they couldn't study it, they just wouldn't fund it. And the language here said that, in this last bill, said they can study it.
But he recanted, Dickey did,
Dickey,
didn't
yeah,
he?
he
I think
did.
on his
Yeah.
deathbed.
Right before his death.
That he was misinterpreted, and that's not really what he meant for that to happen. Yeah, so.
Professor Powell? You're uncharacteristic.
No,
for
I'm
the board
good.
at
I'm
this
good.
moment.
I don't-
All right,
I
all
don't-
right.
One thing, it seems if you treat gun violence on some level as a public health issue, maybe there's an analogy that can be drawn to tobacco. I don't know how that would work, and then that would be a way of sort of giving people their enumerated rights while still operating under a heavy regulatory framework. I mean, that disproportionality of gun violence has to mean something. And it's impacting certain areas like public schools or people of color. That has to mean something structurally. So how do we deal with that? I don't know.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, but it's a conversation that we can have. And here's a question that I hear a lot of. Someone with the intention of bringing a gun into a school will likely not obey a gun-free zone law. The gun-free zone laws then create sitting duck situation and create an easy target. What I hear a lot of is, why create laws when people break them? How do you respond to that? Because I always have to kind of, and I think it's a reasonable question, you know. How does that change things?
Well, I mean, you create laws to hold people accountable for their actions. I mean, I'm assuming everyone here is in favor of laws. I think that would be safe to say. And I mean, we hear that all the time, you know, that creates a gun-free zone. And well, you know, Parkland was not a gun-free zone. There are very few gun-free zones, you know, in existence, because school resource officers can carry, you know, police can carry, sheriffs can carry on school campuses. So that's, you know, and actually most mass shootings happen in a home. People, you know, think about the schools or, you know, what they think about, but actually most of those happen in a home or a private residence. And so people like to throw out the word gun-free zone, but it really is just a red herring.
But that's one of the areas where research could really be helpful. Are people shooting in schools because they have a gripe with the school, or because they think it's a soft target? But, you know, again, I think that's the kind of information we need to have.
Absolutely. Yeah, we need to understand this better. Professor Powell, thoughts?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay. I think we've got time for just one more question, and then we're going to have to wrap up. And I apologize if I didn't get to your specific question, but I hope that we've touched on the subject matter. Gosh. So I'm going to go to my question, actually. Hey, membership has its benefits, you know what I'm saying? And I think we've touched on this, but I want to, in conclusion, we'll say, and I'm going to focus these questions. What can we do? As law students and citizens, I want to ask Congressman Yarmuth and Ms. Courtney, what should we do to help end gun violence in America? As lawyers and future lawyers, Congressman Yarmuth, Professor Powell, what can we do? You know, because there needs to be a call to action. And what is that call to action? And finally, and this one's to you, Ms. Courtney, as citizen activists, you and your organization have been so successful. What can we do? So could you please speak to that?
Well, I mean, I think the number one thing is to find out who your legislators are. When I first started, I had no idea who my state reps were. Could not pick them out of, I mean, and I always say that anytime we have a meeting. And I had no idea. The first time I called Rand Paul's office to ask about the background check bill, I cried. I was so frustrated and angry, and I didn't know what to say. But I think it's important to educate yourself and not be afraid to use your voice and to get involved. And I think, like we've talked about several times, is holding our legislators at the state level accountable, because I do feel like that's where we can do, you know, make the most movement on the issue. We see this a cultural shift. We know that this is not a sprint, it's a marathon. It's going to take a long time. The NRA has been, you know, chipping away at this issue for several years. And it's going to take us a while to get back, you know, to where we're comfortable on the issue.
Absolutely.
You know, it's a question that is, I guess, relates to anything. Get involved, get engaged, offer your legal services to moms or to other groups. The dean was talking about with potential action at the state level or legal action. Offer yourself to do that or lead the way. But mostly it's realizing that there is a change going on in the country right now, and that the political system will respond to citizens if the citizens are persistent enough. That's what it takes.
Yeah, I think that's a good note to end on. I would just say one thing, and I'll just swing for the fences. I think we need to take money out of politics. And then, Congressman Yarmuth, I think, would get elected whatever, because he's strong on principle. You may agree or disagree, but you know you're going to get it straight, and has always been that way, and is an honorable legislator. Look up to him. That would be great if no money was in politics, and that's way up there. But then in a national election, for example, you just have 4 or 5 debates. You have a Federal Election Commission running those. Each of the networks gets an outlet. And nobody gets any money. You just do public forums and do it that way, and then see. And then that takes interest group politics out of it, and you just have issues, and then it's up or down. And I think that would cut down on balkanization and this tribalism and all of that. But that's way up there. But it would be a good start. Yeah.
And you get some good First Amendment cases.
Exactly.
A lot of business for lawyers, and we like to hear that, don't we?
Yeah.
Huh?
Yeah.
So I want to share this with you. There was a poll done, and polls are what they are. But after, in the wake of the Parkland shooting, it found that 70% of people polled, and hopefully this was a good cross section. Polling agencies do what they do. Who backed stricter gun laws. This was up from 52% after Las Vegas. Las Vegas was far more impactful in the number of lives, but only 52% of people supported stricter gun laws after Las Vegas. After Parkland, it's up to 70. And I would ask you, what's different? And I would submit, from my own perspective, citizen activism. We've heard so much more, and people getting loud, and people, doing what these three are doing, and doing in their organization, speaking out, and marching, and showing up. That's moved that needle 18%. I don't know any politician in America that probably wouldn't, do much of anything to move a needle 18%. That's a great number because people got involved. And we're not talking about the repeal of the Second Amendment. We're talking about just stronger gun laws that maybe make us all a little bit safer. So just to wrap, a nice little bow on it, your citizen activism matters. Whatever side you support that side. Get involved. And for the love of God, vote. And get 5 other people to vote with you. It's incredible that we live in a nation where people don't. If you want to talk about a foundational act of anything, it's not the Second Amendment or even the Constitution. It's your right to vote. So that's really important. I'm going to call my vice president up to join me. We're going to thank you for your all of your support all year long. We're going to thank our panel, but I want to have a couple of words with John.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you all for all of your questions. I had the opportunity to curate them a little bit before giving them to David, and we made an effort to get every one of them from all sides of the aisle, the questions that were softballs and the ones that were tougher. There were several on campaign finance. I wish we could have gotten to a little more in the impact, so I'm glad you hit that. If you had the ability to solve gun violence with one thing, what it would have been, lots of very good questions that I wish we could have gotten to. And why does Trump get a pass when he says take the guns first and due process second? What would have happened had President Obama said that? And Congressman Yarmuth, I almost, a la Stephen Colbert, had you argue the opposite side. What was it you had to argue on the Colbert?
Kittens and
report?
wood chippers.
Yeah, kittens and wood chippers. I almost tried to turn
It's
the table.
available on YouTube. It's available on YouTube. It's pretty funny.
Yeah, but I didn't put myself up there with Stephen Colbert, so didn't try for that. Anyway, thank you for your all's participation and for being here, and to our panel so much. Just wanted to express that everything we're doing here on campus, as well as transitioning into the professional chapter. We hope that you will be a part of that, and grab a highlighter, a constitution, something like that on the way out, and make sure, if you don't mind, to sign up. Just give us your information if you're interested in more stuff like this, because this is just the beginning. Back to you, Dave.
Well, thank you very much. And now, ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in a huge round of applause for our great panelists today?